Cutthroat are the meanest, nastiest, biggest, gnarliest trout that ever roamed planet Earth. They're like a modern-day dinosaur. They just want to rip your face off. Okay, they're not. In fact, they've got a reputation for being kind of easy to catch. Sometimes they are, but cutthroat are a lot more than just eager dry fly eaters. They're the West's native trout. They're a hugely important part of one of the world's most unique and diverse ecosystems, and catching a big cutthroat is one of fly fishing's most rewarding experiences. This week on Untangled, you'll learn why us Western anglers hold the cutthroat in such high regard. They've got an incredible story, and by the end of this episode, you'll want to become part of it. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Today we get to talk about a fish that I think is near and dear to the hearts of a lot of anglers, even if you don't live out west. If you've got to plan a trip to come out here to catch some cutthroat, hopefully this episode will wet your whistle until your next cutthroat encounter. But cutthroat, they're my favorite fish, personally. I love them. I love big browns as much as the next angler does, but cutthroat are they're special in a lot of different ways. And I think what makes them so special, to me at least, but I think other anglers probably hopefully share this sentiment, is their entire story. And it's not just what they look like and where they live, although that's really cool. It's everything about this fish and how woven into the history of the West the cutthroat trout is. I mean, give you an example. Father Escalante, when he came and explored Utah, what is Utah now? I can't remember the dates. I just remember that he did it. But he ran into a band of Native Americans on the shores of Utah Lake, which at that time was a crystal clear body of water. And he recorded stories about these giant trout, and we know now they were cutthroat trout. They were Bonneville cutthroat living in this crystal clear, beautiful lake. And they were huge, like up to 20-pound fish. And I want to say that was like back in the 1400s. So even back that far, the cutthroat have played just this integral role in the history of the West. And that's part of what makes them so interesting. But to really understand everything about the cutthroat, we got to go back to high school biology for a minute and take a look at where they fit in the world so we can really understand their story. And I know I said high school biology. Don't turn the show off. Stay here. It's not going to be boring. I promise. This is relevant, useful information that you are actually going to use later in life. Yeah, how about that? Crazy, isn't it? Maybe if schools, did that more, kids would hate going less, but what do I know? So cutthroat trout, they have a lighter brown body with a lot of dark black spots. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of cutthroat trout, but they'll all follow that general coloration trend. And then, of course, they do have the bright orange, or sometimes they can be red slashes right under their jaw, which is where they got their names from. During spawning season is when cutthroat are really going to dress to impress. They're not going to pull their punches during spawning season. That's when they look their prettiest. The Colorado River cutthroat, which we'll talk about later in the show here, I think they might be the prettiest of them all because they just get blood red all the way from their head, almost all the way down to their tail. Sometimes it'll go all the way up onto their gill plates, up onto the sides of their belly. It's so cool to see them when they look like that. But they'll also have some yellows and oranges in their coloration too, depending on what kind of cutthroat you're catching. And then they are a cutthroat or a member of the genus Oncorhynchus, which is in the Salmonidae family, just like every other trout. They're all part of that Salmonidae family. And if you remember back to the episode we did on rainbow trout in this series about different trout species, rainbows are also members of the Oncorhynchus genus. So that is their genus. Rainbow trout are Oncorhynchus mincus. Cutthroat trout have a bunch of different species that we'll get into, but that makes the cutthroat and the rainbow basically cousins. So they get together, they hang out, they watch football on the weekends, they go to vacation together, and etc. They really will. They can actually hybridize together because they're so closely related genetically. They can reproduce fertile offspring, even, which is kind of cool. But what really makes the cutthroat trout, I think, stand out in the fish world, even more so than their unique life history and where they live, is just how many different species of cutthroat there are, and then how many different subspecies of cutthroat exist. You could really have like one little group of cutthroat that evolved in this drainage, and they got this really cool genetic traits and maybe a little bit different life history. And then 10 miles up and over the mountain in the next basin, there's another group that are cutthroat, but they've evolved completely differently. And they really fought hard to exist on this landscape and to persist in the West. And again, that's just one of the really cool things about cutthroat trout. But as it stands today, there are 4 distinct cutthroat species that exist, and then there's a whole bunch of subspecies that fall within those species. So your 4 main species are the coastal cutthroat, which is Oncorhynchus clarkii, the West Slope cutthroat, which is Oncorhynchus lewisii, the Lahontan cutthroat, Oncorhynchus henshawii, and the Rocky Mountain cutthroat, Oncorhynchus virginalis. So starting with the coastal cutthroat trout, they are native to Alaska, Oregon, California, and Washington, but like their name implies, they live in coastal areas, places that are going to drain into the Pacific Ocean. So some of these fish can and do spend time in saltwater. They're not just a freshwater trout. They will live in saltwater for a little bit. They don't really overwinter in the ocean the way that steelhead do. They don't make these really long spawning runs like steelhead and salmon do, but it is kind of cool that you got a cutthroat trout that'll go live in the ocean for a little bit. And then coastal cutthroat, are also unique because they are the only cutthroat species that doesn't have a whole bunch of subspecies listed under it. So they just kind of stand all on their own and do their own thing. Now, your West Slope cutthroat is the next one we'll talk about. West Slopes are native to Montana, a tiny sliver of Wyoming, which is inside what is today Yellowstone National Park, and then Idaho, Alberta, British Columbia, and Washington. And West Slope have a whole bunch of subspecies that have evolved in all these different river drainages. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, the West Slope really exemplifies how you can have one species here and then 20 miles this way, you've got another species, because there's just so much difference in the landscape and how the fish have to evolve to live on it, that they end up being very genetically unique and different from each other. One example of this is the Salmon River cutthroat trout, which that is a subspecies of the West Slope, but it's only native to the Salmon River drainage in Idaho. So that's the only place you're going to find the Salmon River cutthroat trout, was within that drainage. And for a long time, it was actually thought that West Slopes were just a single subspecies, but there's been a lot of research done lately in about the past decade or so that's shown there's a lot more genetic diversity within the West Slope genome that makes all of these fish pretty unique, and they all deserve their own classification as a distinct subspecies, not just all lumped in with the West Slope. Now, does it really matter if you're catching this Salmon River cutthroat trout versus just a regular old West Slope? No, not really, but it's still cool to know all this stuff. That's why we do these episodes, because it's fun to take this deep dive and to learn more about these fish. Your West Slope have a pretty big area that they inhabit as well. I mean, Montana's huge, and they're going to be native to that. Mostly the Pacific Ocean drainages in Montana as well. Next up are the Lahontan cutthroat trout. Now, these are native to Nevada, California, and Oregon, and the most famous fish in the Lahontan cutthroat world is the giant Lahontans that live in Pyramid Lake out there in Nevada. Now, Lahontans are the biggest of all the cutthroat subspecies. If you want to catch a cutthroat over 10 pounds, your best bet is a Lahontan, because they evolved in lakes to prey on chubs and other little bait fish in lakes instead of in rivers. Like a lot of the other cutthroats spent most of their time evolving in high country streams and rivers. The Lahontans had these big lakes to grow up in. So they got big just partly as a defense mechanism against predators, but then also because they had so much food to eat. So they evolved into that, and they did wonderfully for it. And that's why they still stay so big now. The world record cutthroat actually is a Lahontan. It was caught in 1925 and it weighed 41 pounds, which is really hard to wrap your head around. It's hard to wrap your head around a 40-pound trout, let alone a 41-pound cutthroat. But this is what's really fun. There's pictures and there's anecdotal stories of fish that were probably bigger than that 41-pounder. That's just the official world record. So who knows? It might have even been a 50-pounder kicking around there. And like I mentioned, these lake fish, just the lake cutthroat, have the ability to grow very large. You look at the Bonneville cutthroat in Utah, for example, and they can grow pretty big. And they grew very big back in Utah Lake when Father Escalante came through. Hopefully in the 1400s. Hopefully I'm not getting my history wrong with that little example. But these days anyways, 20-pound fish are 20-pound Lahontans are fairly common. I'd say you see a good number of those caught every year out of Pyramid Lake. But a 31-pounder was actually caught in 2023, so just like 2 years ago. The really giant fish might actually be returning to Pyramid. So if you ever want to make a trip out there to Pyramid Lake and get into a big fish, go do it, but be prepared for one of the most frustrating fishing experiences of your life. I spent 3 years fishing Pyramid, not like 3 years, that's all I did, but I went 2 or 3 times a year for 3 years before I caught my first Lahontan, before I put it in the net. And in fact, on one of the earliest trips, I was sitting there and we were standing on our ladders like you do, because you drag these ladders out into the shallows because you want to fish right on the drop-off. We know in lakes, fish love to cruise the drop-offs, and it's so shallow for so long that you haul your ladder out and you stand on it above the drop-off. It just makes casting easier. But anyways, we're standing on our ladders. I got a buddy to the left of me, buddy to the right of me, and they both hooked up into fish almost at the same time. So they're fighting these fish. I'm standing right in between them. I've got the exact same flies at the exact same depth. Fish just ignore me completely. And finally, I think they both landed their fish. I hooked into one. And this was day 3 or 4 of the trip, and I just had my butt kicked. I hadn't caught anything all trip, and everybody else had been catching fish. So I hook into this, and I've got it on for a second, and I'm getting really excited because I finally got my Lahontan on. I'm going to catch it. I'm going to put it in the net. And then it popped off like 10 seconds into the fight. And I'm not proud of this, but I got so mad and so frustrated that I just started swearing and hollering, and I threw my whole fly rod into the lake. And I stomped back to the trailer. And I was not a happy camper. I just threw this big old fit, chucked my rod in the lake, and it was not one of my better moments at all. I'm really kind of ashamed of it, to be honest, but I got so frustrated. My buddy Hiram actually fished my rod out of the water for me. Thank you, Hiram. I appreciate it. I still fish that rod to this day, but I was so mad. I'm glad I don't get that mad over fish anymore, but it will get under your skin like that. Pyramid has the capability to get under your skin like that. One other cool note about the Lahontan cutthroat trout is that the Lahontan species also includes the subspecies called the Paiute cutthroat trout, which I think might be one of the most unique of all the cutthroat because it hardly has any spots on its body. It's got a few, usually towards the tail, but the main part of its body, it has like no spots on it. And they were really only native to 11 miles of river. Again, you'll find this with cutthroat all the time. You've got this unique, awesome species that's native to just this tiny sliver of the world, which I just think it's cool that they can do that they can evolve that way and be so unique that they're their own species or they're their own subspecies at that point. But they were native to this 11-mile stretch of Silver King Creek, which is a tributary of the East Carson River in the Sierra Nevada in California. And the Paiute also have this distinct purple hue on their body, which is a little bit different coloration than you see in a lot of other cutthroat. They're probably the rarest cutthroat, and they're certainly one of the rarest trout still alive in the West. I really want to go fish for them eventually. I just need to make it out to California, but we'll see if that ever happens. So that's your hunting cutthroat. And then we finally have the Rocky Mountain cutthroat trout, which the Rocky Mountain cutthroat is the species that has all of the subspecies that are kind of like the rock stars of the cutthroat family. These are the guys that steal the headlines that are really flashy. Your Yellowstone, your Snake Rivers, the Colorado Rivers, the Bonnevilles, the Bear Rivers, the San Juans, the Rio Grandes, the Greenbacks, just to name a few of the subspecies that fall into the Rocky Mountain species of cutthroat. There is so much interesting history with every single one of these fish. We could honestly, and maybe we need to, but we could honestly do an in-depth episode on each subspecies within the Rocky Mountain cutthroat family. But one example, just to give you a taste of what their life history is like and the cool things that they've had to put up with to evolve and stick around today, is the Bear River cutthroat. So for years, a lot of scientists thought the Bear River and the Bonneville cutthroat, which are both native to Utah, but they thought they were basically the exact same fish because they look very similar. The Bear River drains into the Great Salt Lake, so it drains into the Bonneville Basin because the Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake are remnants of what used to be Lake Bonneville, which covered most of Utah, I think parts of Nevada as well, way back when it was a thing. And then as the lake receded, it stranded all these little populations of fish up in the tributaries and whatnot. So scientists thought the Bear River and the Bonneville were basically the same fish. But studies done fairly recently showed that the Bear River cutthroat and the Yellowstone cutthroat, which you might recognize Yellowstone as being very far away from Utah, but these studies show that the Bear River and the Yellowstone cutthroat are actually more genetically closely related than Bear River cutthroat and Bonneville cutthroat. And that's because the Bear River actually used to flow into the Snake River until about 500,000 years ago when some volcanic activity made the Bear River turn south and it cut it off completely from the entire Snake River drainage. Now, the Bear River, if you're not familiar with this geography, it flows, Utah's got that little cutout right at the top right corner, and it flows out of the Uinta Mountains into Wyoming just a little bit, into Idaho, and then it makes this big south turn and comes back into Utah. And it probably flowed into the Snake probably somewhere around Idaho Falls in that area, but all that volcanic activity made it make that big U-turn, turn around and dump south into Utah. And that is just one example of how interesting and diverse the life history is of the cutthroat trout, because the Bear Rivers are actually closer in relation to the Yellowstones, because for a long time, the fish in the Bear River had access to the entire Snake River drainage, including salmon, steelhead, all that other stuff that could come up. So just really interesting. Or no, salmon and steelhead couldn't make it up that far, could they? Because of Twin Falls. Never mind. It's still early this morning. I haven't had all of my Diet Coke yet, so pardon me for a minute. But they still had access to that entire Snake River drainage, which is pretty cool. But what this crazy amount of cutthroat subspecies illustrates is just, and I mentioned this a couple of times, but just how baked into the landscape the cutthroat trout is here in the West. It feels like, again, every mountain range or drainage has its own flavor of cutthroat that's unique to that area. It makes these fish feel just as important on the landscape as our elk or our deer or our pronghorn or our desert bighorn sheep. They matter that much. And since they've been on the landscape for so long, they've been here for as long as we can really tell, they play this huge role in all of our native ecosystems out here. And we're lucky in the West to have a lot of intact ecosystems still left. It's not as much as I'd like, but we still have a lot of it left. And the Yellowstone cutthroat might be a really good example of just how important these fish are, not just to anglers, not just to people who love fish, but to the entire ecosystem itself. Yellowstone Park used just to be full of cutthroat. But between some overfishing, habitat loss, and then the real kicker was the introduction of some non-native species, which started outcompeting your cutthroat trout. they've really, really suffered. In fact, there was a moment in time when it looked like Yellowstone cutthroat really wouldn't exist in Yellowstone anymore. And if they did, it would be in extremely isolated areas, especially in the Yellowstone Lake and Yellowstone River areas, because the lake trout got introduced into Yellowstone Lake, I think back in the 80s or late 70s, early 80s, I believe, is when that happened. And lake trout are not native there. So they came in and they just kind of wrecked the whole ecosystem. They eat tons of the baby cutthroat trout because lake trout are very predatory. And when you've got a big predator like that with nothing to check it, no way to keep that population in check, the prey population, in this case the cutthroat, is going to suffer pretty severely. So the lake trout get in, they eat all the tiny baby cutthroat. That does a number on your cutthroat population. Well, as the cutthroat started to disappear from Yellowstone Lake, from all the tributaries to it, from the Yellowstone River, a lot of all the other species in the park started to suffer. Your otters, your bears, your eagles, your ospreys, these are animals that depend on cutthroat for food, especially when the cutthroat are spawning in late spring and early summer. They're really easy pickings at that point. But your otters, your bears, your eagles, your osprey, they diminished in numbers pretty significantly during this time frame. But then once cutthroat restoration started in Yellowstone, and we really started focusing on putting these fish back, curbing that lake trout population, getting the Yellowstone cutthroat back onto the landscape, a lot of those animals have seen a pretty big rebound, especially the otters. I actually wrote a paper in college for my college biology class about the rebound of otter populations in relation to the restoration of cutthroat trout in Yellowstone. And a big reason this happened is because lake trout, they don't spawn in streams. So when they don't offer that same easy food source that spawning cutthroat do, because spawning cutthroat are a piece of cake for a bear to wade in and grab, or the eagles or the ospreys or the otters just to go grab them because they spawn in shallow rivers, very similar to salmon in a lot of ways. And they can just go in and kind of feast on them. We've all seen those videos, I think, of the grizzlies eating the salmon in Alaska. Well, it used to look that way with them eating the cutthroat in Yellowstone. In fact, there was even, I saw a scientist who floated this hypothesis that the increased grizzly bear predation on elk in Yellowstone was due in part to the lack of Yellowstone cutthroat in the streams for the grizzlies to eat. Now, I couldn't find any studies to back that up. I just found that hypothesis floated out there. But the fact that it was even considered shows you, again, just how important cutthroat trout are to their various ecosystems, how much they matter to having a thriving, wild experience out there in the world. And that's really what makes cutthroat so special to catch. That's why we love them so much here, because they're not just another trout. They're a native fish that still call some of the most incredible scenery on this planet home. You get up into the high country of Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, you're in this place that just feels unreal. It really does. Like it shouldn't exist, like you're in a painting. And then you get to catch cutthroat, which are, in my opinion, the prettiest of all the trout. So you get to catch this gorgeous fish out of this gorgeous place, and it's native there. It's so cool. It's almost the chance to do that, to catch these fish out of those high country locations. I think that's as close as we're ever going to get to experiencing what the first settlers felt when they came out to settle the West a couple hundred years ago, which if I had a time machine, 100%, first thing I'm doing is going back to like 1850 and fishing all of Wyoming and Montana and Idaho with no crowds and all the big fish. That's 100% what I'm going to go do. So cutthroat, they're special. They do have that reputation for being easy to catch, but that's because, like a lot of other fish, especially the brook trout, you look at the brook trout, they evolved in these rugged streams and lakes where the growing seasons are very short and there's very few other predators in the river system. So the cutthroat felt pretty comfortable feeding openly on the dry flies. And again, they're very similar to brook trout in that they'll take advantage of any food drifting by. So if your flies have a decent drift, you've got a really good chance of catching A cutthroat, they'll just come up and eat it so long as that drift looks good. That doesn't really make them dumb. That just makes them opportunistic. And then the big ones, especially though, big cutthroat aren't dumb. I've watched big cutthroat in freestone streams in the backcountry be just as picky as tailwater brown trout before. They can be as frustrating as those fish at times. And speaking of big cutthroat out there in the backcountry, when you catch a trophy cutthroat, you realize that fight that the fish had to have to persist in the face of all this habitat loss, all the overfishing, all the non-native fish that have been introduced to where they lived. It really is special. And in some places, that trophy cutthroat might only be like 15 inches long. And on the whole, cutthroat do tend to be a little bit smaller than your rainbows and your browns. But I think anything over probably 18 inches is definitely worth getting really excited about. If you can catch a cutthroat over 18, it's a wonderful fish. All right, enough of all that stuff. How do you go catch one of these yourself? What's the play there? Well, the first tip is to not fish during the spawn. We want to let these fish persist on the landscapes. We leave them alone when they're spawning, and that happens in late spring through about early summer. Usually right around the peak of runoff is when they're spawning. The cutthroat are going to spawn in rivers and creeks with gravel bottoms that are generally pretty shallow and always well oxygenated. They need a very high water quality where they're going to spawn and where they're going to live. The best time to chase cutthroat in their native drainages, so out here in the west where they live, is from about July through the first big frost of the year when it gets really cold and the fish all kind of shut down for the year. It's a short season, but it is some of the most incredible fishing you will ever have. And I personally think if you've got a bucket list of few fish, I think the Bear River and the Colorado River cutthroat are the two prettiest of the subspecies. They've got the flashiest colors, so you'll need to head to Utah, Colorado, or Wyoming to catch those. But what can really be helpful, if you want to come out west and catch some cutthroat, you can try the Wyoming Cut Slam or the Utah Cutthroat Slam. These are just programs where you go, you sign up, and I think it costs money in both states, but it goes towards cutthroat conservation. But you go catch each of the native cutthroat in those states, and you have to catch them from their historical native range. So you'd have to catch a Colorado River cutthroat from the Colorado River Basin. And then once you've done that, you get a certificate, and in Utah, you get a commemorative coin. It's a fun way to experience all these fish. Both Utah and Wyoming have websites that tell you these are the rivers where you can find the cutthroat. This is the best time of year to go. They've got directions to all the rivers. So it's really all laid out there so you can go find it and kind of plan your own trip. Even if you don't do the slam, you can still use that information. And there's tons of information online about catching cutthroat. They're not really a secret. Okay, maybe the big ones are a secret, but folks are generally pretty happy to share cutthroat spots with other anglers just so you can have an opportunity to go out and catch this truly incredible, unique fish. And I hope y'all take advantage of it. If not this summer, at some point in your angling careers, I promise it's an experience you're going to want to have. And with that, folks, hopefully I got you interested in the cutthroat. If you'd like to learn any more or have some comments or stories even about cutthroat trout, feel free to drop a comment and let me know. But we're going to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question you would like answered, go ahead and send those on in to me. There's a link to do that in the show notes or right here on the screen if you are watching the video podcast. And the first question comes to us this week from Tyler from Nevada, writes in and says, at what age could I start teaching my kids how to fly fish, and what would be a good setup for them? My daughter is 10 and my son almost 8. I just feel the typical 5-weight, 9-foot rod would be a little too big for them. Do they make an affordable kid setup, or should I just look into a lighter weight, shorter rod? Love the podcast and all you guys do. Dr. Pepper is king. Tyler, great question. Even if your taste in soda is a little suspect. No, nothing's wrong with Dr. Pepper, man. It's great stuff. I think I might be in the minority here. I'm not sure. But I just teach kids on a 9'5" weight, especially at those ages you mentioned, 10 and 8. The kids I've taught who are that young handled it pretty well. I've also had a few friends who've had their kids fishing since they could walk, and those kids were flinging 9-foot rods at age 10 better than most adults I know, and certainly better than me. But when I've taught kids to fly fish, I just do it with the gear that I've got on hand, and I've got plenty of 9'5" weights, so that's what I always just grab. The 9'5" weight's the rod that we recommend for every beginner to use because it's the jack of all trades rod, right? It'll throw dries, it'll throw streamers, it'll throw nymphs. It can handle some wind, it can handle some bigger fish. It just does everything very well. It doesn't do anything excellently, but it does a lot of things very well. It's very versatile, so you can really fish just about any way and anywhere you want to with that 9'5" weight. So my thought process is I'm going to give kids the same tools and instruction that I give to adults, just teach them that same way, and that may or may not be the right move. But that's why I've always just defaulted to using that 9'5" weight when I've taught kids to fish. Now, some kids might find it too long or too heavy or too unlike anything else they've ever used, especially if they've never fished before. In that case, if they've never fished before, they're not used to fishing poles of any kind, then a shorter, lighter rod might feel less intimidating to the kid, might just be easier for them to use. But I think it's more of a case-by-case basis than something we can make a blanket statement about. They do make some kid-focused rods, and what those rods are designed to do is help the kids learn how to feel the flex of the rod during the cast. So they bend deeper, I think, than a lot of us would be used to, but they can really help the kids feel that. And they are a bit shorter. Typically, most of the ones I see are about 8 feet long instead of 9 feet, so a little bit shorter, but they're all still 5 weights. So if you've got a 5-weight rig of your own, you would just need that rod for your kid. Then you can use your reel and line on it, which is nice. But you're still, even if you get those smaller kid-sized rods, you're still going to teach your kids how to cast, where to cast, how to set the hook, how to fight the fish, all of that stuff that they need to know. And obviously, it's going to be age appropriate. You're not going to give an 8-year-old a sermon on seams. as much fun as that might sound, sometimes it's probably not the best play with an 8-year-old. But you're still going to show them, hey, cast right there, and do those little things. So even though the rod might be a little bit shorter, you're not really going to change how or what you teach them. You're still going to show them the rope so they can be successful at it. Echo makes a pretty good kid's rod, the Echo Gecko. In fact, I know a guy who spent the entire summer once fishing with an Echo Gecko because he just wanted to see how it worked, and he really didn't have too many complaints about it, which I thought was pretty surprising. He said he liked it, so I thought that was pretty cool. You can look into those rods, or you can buy something that you think the kids will use when they fall in love with it, because they will fall in love with fly fishing, right? Yeah, they don't got a choice. They're our kids. Dadgummit, they're going to have to love it, right? That's how it works. That's how this parenting thing works, isn't it? I did teach my 8-year-old niece how to fly fish, and I just used a 9'5" weight for it. And it wasn't too tough, but she was a lot more outdoorsy than I think your typical 8-year-old is. Grow up basically on a farm. So she really got the hang of it. I wasn't the best teacher either at that point, but it all worked out just fine. She'd also fished a lot, though, so fishing poles weren't new to her. She was used to being around those. Even though fly rods were new, the whole concept of that wasn't too new to her, so I think that helped. So if your kids don't have a whole lot of experience with outdoorsy stuff or fishing in general, then yeah, those kids' rods really might be the way to go, just to ease them into it a little bit. But again, you know your kids best. So if you think a regular 9'5" weight is too heavy, then definitely follow your gut, go with the shorter rod. It's not gonna mess up the experience for them if you go with a kid's rod. And the kids setups that are out there are pretty decent too. And I can't remember how much that Echo is. want to say like 150, 160 bucks, maybe. I might be way off, but they're not that expensive. So you can get into it for a relatively reasonable price anymore. But appreciate the question, man. Thanks. Adam from Wisconsin has our next question. Writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, thanks for all the great information and truly making fly fishing approachable for me. I am absolutely addicted and I blame you for the many dollars I've spent at the fly shop. On that note, can you give me an idea of the percentage of time you spend actually throwing just dry flies? I just had my first fish on a dry during a caddis hatch a couple weeks ago, but I haven't seen another since, and I'm confused why the shelves of stores are so dry fly oriented when a trout's diet is 90% below the surface. Do fly tyers just enjoy tying parachute atoms a bunch? Plus, I saw a ton of BWOs last week and trout weren't even rising for them. Seems to me a size 16 to 18 pheasant tail has been working about everywhere." Well, Adam, this is a great question, and you have just discovered one of the truths of fly fishing, that a lot of flies are tied to catch fishermen and not fish. So there's a reason there's so many flashy flies out there, because you make a little money selling flies sometimes, especially the fly shops. If I had to put a number on it, I'd say roughly 20% of my time is spent fishing only dry flies. I do fish during the winter a lot, and I'll throw dries during winter midge hatches or the early mayfly hatches that come off in the late winter. But most of my winter fishing is with some kind of double nymph rig or streamers. But once the dries start coming out in pretty good numbers, in mid-spring, I'm fishing a dry dropper a lot. I'll switch back to my nymph rigs when runoff comes around, and then I'll be throwing my smaller nymph rigs and streamer rigs on lakes during ice off. But if I'm on a river between June and November, I'm almost always tossing a dry dropper of some sort. So your question is, how often do I only fish dries? That's why I pegged it at like 20%. But if you're willing to count the dry dropper, then I'm probably like 55% of the time I have a dry fly on my rig of some sort. Now, I only go to dry flies and just dry flies during picky hatches. Usually that's going to be your mayfly and your midge hatches. And even then, I'll only do it when all the fish are looking up and they're all eating emergers and the duns, because otherwise I'll still usually have a little nymph dropper on just to run it because they can still be very effective that way. But my purely dry fly time, probably about 20%, it's going to be mostly during those mayfly midge hatches when the fish get really picky, and sometimes they want that exact cripple or that exact emerger pattern, and you've got to present it just right. So I'll go just dry fly at that point. I do think it's pretty interesting, though, that your fly shops seem to be so dry fly heavy. I know my local shops are definitely nymph oriented, and I live in a place where the dry fly fishing's really good, but there's still more nymphs than dries for sale in my shop. So maybe where you're at in Wisconsin's just like dry fly heaven, which, I mean, if it is, man, go out there and have some fun. Kidding aside, you do have to remember that regardless of what's on the fly shop shelves, roughly 80% of a fish's diet is subsurface. So it's all those nymphs. So they're only eating off a surface for a very small amount of all of their food. And that really feels counterintuitive to us because we don't see that subsurface feeding. The only feeding we see is what happens on top. So you think of how much fish are feeding during a good hatch, how it can feel like every fish in the river, and usually it is, every fish in the river is up and eating off the top. That's really only like 20% of their food for the whole day. So yeah, 100% it makes sense that pheasant tail that you were mentioning is going to be such a great fly. And kind of following that vein, I saw a post a while ago. It was in a forum or a group somewhere. I can't remember. But this guy was talking about his go-to flies that he loves and how most of his go-to flies were nymphs. And that kind of got me thinking, well, what flies do I use most often? And yeah, even though sometimes I give Alex a hard time for loving his nymphing so much, I use nymphs pretty stinking all the time. And not that there's anything wrong with nymphing, right? I just like to joke around and give each other a hard time sometimes. But I've got Frenchies, Perdigone, zebra midges, all my various stonefly imitations, my micro mayflies, my caddis nymphs. The list of different nymphs I've got is pretty long. And then the dry fly collection really isn't very diverse. I've got a lot of parachute flies, some standard hackle flies like the elk hair caddis, the PMDs, some drakes, and then I've got my foam hoppers, got some ants, and that really rounds out my dry fly collection. Where my personal fly collection starts to look like a fly shop is with the emergers and the cripples, because in my opinion, you can never have too many emerger or cripple patterns because you never know which one the fish are going to want that day. Just having a lot of different variations of mayfly, midge, and caddis emergers and cripples has done me very well over the years, and I firmly believe you want a good selection of those just so you can match the different sizes and shapes of all the different bugs that'll come off at some point. But all that is to say, it's just a really long way of saying you're on the right track with what you're thinking. Don't worry about it too much. Just continue to fish the way that's successful for you. So I appreciate the question, though. Thanks a bunch for sending it in. Hayden from Utah has our next question, writes it and says, Spencer, love the show, man. VFC has such great resources for learning how to improve the craft. My question is about mending. I understand how important it is to mend in order to achieve drag-free drift, but here's the thing. I suck at mending. I feel like every time I mend, even when I try to do it softly or lightly, I jerk my rig around and there's no way it looks natural to the fish. What tips do you have for learning how to properly mend for nymphing and for dries? Well, Hayden, don't worry, man. Hey, mending can be tricky to get the hang of. In all honesty, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, I don't think I've done as good of a job explaining it on the podcast as I could. So I think part of that's on me. So let's go right from the ground up with mending for a minute. And one thing I want you to remember is that if your indicator or your dry fly, if you've got a dry dropper rig on over, or if you're just fishing a single dry, but if your indicator or your dry fly moves a little bit during a mend, that is not the end of the world. Okay. A good dead drift with no drag is always the ideal, but bugs don't always just sit there and never move. We've talked about this a lot in recent episodes about swinging flies and presenting flies with a little bit of drag on them to skate them, to mimic the movement of flies up to the surface as an emerger, or when they're adults and they're on the water, they're trying to get out of the water so they can get to the bushes, they can mate, they can come back, lay their eggs, and continue their life cycle. Yes, that dead drift, that drag-free drift isn't ideal in a lot of situations, but it's not always the ideal. So the only time that I would say you really want to beat yourself up, and even then I wouldn't say beat yourself up, but the only time I would worry about a mend that doesn't move your fly at all, when you need that quote-unquote perfect mend, is if you are fishing during a dry fly hatch, specifically with midges or mayflies, because midges and mayflies, in my experience, tend to move the least on the water surface. So if you're fishing with those, you need to throw a mend. Any extra movement of that midge or mayfly can kind of put fish off sometimes. I've found that fish get the pickiest about perfect presentation with the midge and the mayfly hatches because, again, I'm not saying that this is universal everywhere. I'm just telling you my experience. And that is that I see the midges and the mayflies really don't move too much on the water. Now, your caddis and your stoneflies, they're making a ruckus on the water compared to the mayflies, right? They're skittering, they're trying to get away. But your midges and your mayflies really aren't moving too much. So that's the time when I would take extra care to make them in that doesn't move that fly, because any little extra movement, especially if you're on a tailwater or a spring creek or anywhere that the fish are picky, can turn fish off of that fly. That little bit of extra movement can tell them, oh, this ain't real, and they'll scamper. So to achieve that perfect mend, it's really important to think of the mend as one fluid motion. I see a lot of folks who try to mend their line. They'll pick their line up, they'll pause, and then they'll flick the line, almost like it's a second cast or a mini roll cast. In my experience, again, I'm not telling you this is universal, it's just what works for me. I've found that when I lift, pause, and then make the mend, It almost always leads to bad mends that move my flies a ton, whether it's a dry fly or a nymph. I also see a problem where folks put a lot more into their mend than they need. I shouldn't say that's the reason, but that's one of the main reasons that you're moving those flies, because most mends, especially for trout fishing on smaller rivers, they can be achieved by using just the tip of your rod to move that fly line. You do not need to use the entire rod to basically roll cast that line. Okay. The mend, ideally, all your mend is going to look like is this. You're going to lift your rod tip a little bit, and then you're going to flick just that rod tip in the direction that the mend needs to go. So if it's an upstream mend, flick that rod tip upstream and it'll carry that fly line. You want to lift enough to pull a few feet of fly line off of the water and break the surface tension that's kind of holding that fly line there in place. But don't lift too much or too hard so that it moves your fly. It's just a gentle lift. But remember, you're going to lift and toss the mend with the tip of your rod. And if you do that, you're going to end up where you want that mend to be without moving the fly as well. It's just lift and toss with the tip of the rod. And it's one fluid motion. If you need to throw bigger mends, if you're on a bigger river or it's got more line out, you need a bigger mend, then you just scale up that technique and you use more than just the tip of the rod to move the line. But again, most mends aren't all that big and they can be accomplished just by using the tip of your fly rod. And the technique for the perfect mend is the same whether you're fishing dries or nymphs. But I think with nymphs, you've got a bit more room for error because the bobber isn't as sensitive as the dry fly, so it moves a little bit less. You still want to be careful, but you've got a little bit more room for error, in my experience, when you're mending a nymph rig than you do with a dry fly. We also have a video that explains mending as well. It's a lot easier to see it than it is to listen, but hopefully one of those tips helped. I'll throw a link to that video either in the show notes or right here on the screen as well if you're watching the video podcast. But hopefully those tips helped. And if you need anything else about mending, don't hesitate to reach out. Well, folks, that wraps up the Q&A section for the show this week, but don't go anywhere because we've got the Live Real Life moment next. Every week, we end the show by sharing stories and pictures from folks who are out on the water living real life. We love to get these stories, to share them, and I love to see what y'all are up to out there. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you would like to share, you can send that in via the link in the show notes or at the QR code that you see on your screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Danny, writes in and says, a few years ago, I camped by a small stream about 10 feet wide in North Carolina with the intention of fishing for the duration of the trip. As soon as I had set up camp, I investigated the water and could see a school of decent-sized rainbow trout resting in a pool close to the bank. All weekend, they stayed within a quarter of a mile of the section of the stream I was camping by. I tried everything I had using a spinning rod. Rooster tails, newts, worms, etc., muttering, "Eat the food, Tina," under my breath. For 2 days, I caught nothing. I was frustrated and heartbroken. There was a point where I took my net and waded into the water, exclaiming, "Fine, I'll just net y'all from where you sit." Obviously, that didn't work out, and a human marching angrily through the water with a net is no match for the graceful and speedy trout, so I retreated to camp to sit and ponder and shed a tear. This past weekend, I returned to the same campsite with my fly rod, tied on a parachute Adams, switching to other flies here and there, and caught over 40 trout in the span of 3 days. Sounds unbelievable, but this is not an exaggeration. Most were pretty small rainbows, but this nicely sized 14-inch rainbow that is pictured surprised me towards the end of the trip. Excuse the low-quality photo. I didn't take time to take a decent one. I was a little too excited. Anyways, I just wanted to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to everyone over at VFC for the wealth of information that you provide to novice fly anglers. The YouTube videos, the podcast, the gear has all been so invaluable to me over the past few months. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening, laughing, and learning with you guys, and look forward to everything you release in the future. P.S. Diet Coke for the win, forever and always. Danny, first off, incredibly well written. Thank you. I love the little the punch that you added to the story here. And second, congratulations. That's freaking fantastic you got out there and did that. It's so cool to go back to a place that whooped your butt first and then whoop its butt second, isn't it? It's so much stinking fun. And thank you for the kind words about what we're doing at VFC. These experiences, what you just had, Danny, that's what it's all about for us here. We want y'all to have that experience. We want y'all to just enjoy the heck out of yourselves out there on the water. That's what podcasts, the videos, that's what it's all for. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Really appreciate it. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap the show up this week. Thank you so much for watching the entire thing, listening to the entire thing. That helps us out more than you can know. And we've got tons of other awesome content. Just in case you're curious, want to learn some more about what we got going on, there's links everywhere to find it. So go check those out. And if you could, please make sure you take a minute to rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, helps us spread the word to more anglers, helps us help them live real life, which again is what we're all about here. So until next week, everybody, get out on the water, enjoy yourselves, go catch some fish, and live real life.